The Gods of the Gap Fallacy. Jerry Bergman's written an excellent article about this, and this is what we're going to discuss on Revolution Against Evolution. Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And your co-host Rich Gear here as well. And Jerry, welcome back to the show. Thank you for coming back on.
Thank
Talk
you.
about this article.
Good to be
Yeah.
here.
This particular thing, I have a little personal thing with it because I remember my academic advisor in college when I wrote an article about the left-handed and right-handed amino acid dilemma for a paper for my independent study I did. He read it and he used this God of the gaps argument. He says, well, don't you know that when science discovers something new, it sort of makes their God smaller? And I thought that argument was stupid, actually at the time. But I can see where people are going with this. That they have an idea that if you can explain something from a materialist point of view, you've actually eliminated God out of the equation. Now, what is your answer for that, Jerry?
Well, I find evolutionists use the God of the gaps more than creationists do. Occasionally, of course, gaps are there and we need to respond in some way. But evolutionists have lots of gaps. For example, the fossil record. We have an animal, as we talked about before with whales, an animal that looked like a dog and became a whale in time. Well, all of the links between that dog-like animal and the whale are all gaps. Human evolution, same thing. We have a Australopithecus afarensis here. We got a human over here. How do you bridge that together? Well, you got lots of gaps, and therefore evolution will find the links. So it's evolution of the gaps. So evolution criticizes us for occasionally using that, and they use it really all the time, especially in the fossil record, because there are I think no examples, good examples, valid examples of evolution from some totally non-elephant example to a elephant. And so therefore, how do we go from this pre-elephant, this dog-like creature, into the modern elephant? Well, evolution, they hope, fills it with fossils. But of course, in all cases that I'm aware of, and I've done whole books on this, in all cases, they have not been able to fill all of these gaps. So we have evolution of the gaps, and it's a big problem. By the way, I didn't get my magazine yet. My subscription expired, and I didn't know that. And so I called up CRSQ and I said, I got a problem. And they said, well, we'll get a magazine out to you and you will reinstate your subscription. So don't forget to to renew your subscription and don't let it lapse. But on the other hand, a lot of good arguments against using God of the gaps for evolution. But for creation, in many cases, there are simply gaps between A and B. And of course, we can answer that not by filling the gaps with something, but we can answer it by saying, well, God created this, and then he also created this. And there is not necessarily a gap. So we don't really have a lot of gaps to fill because we understand the Creator created many things and they're separate. But the evolutionists have to connect everything together eventually, or at least in life. And therefore, they have lots of gaps where we don't have them. Where did horses come from? Well, God created them. Where do whales come from? Well, God created them. Where is this dog-like creature that evolved into a whale? Well, God created it. So in many ways, God of the gaps is not used for us. We don't need to because we accept the creation worldview. Whereas, of course, with evolutionists, they can't accept God did A and B, so they simply say, well, we have to fill these gaps, and we will. We'll keep digging. I understand there's well over 1 billion fossils. In fact, several billion fossils. So out of the huge number of fossils that are out there, we certainly should be able to fill some of the gaps at least, but yet there's no single clear example, documented example of any of the evolutionary gaps that are filled in with fossils, in spite of having well over 1 billion fossils. In fact, museums are, if you spend much time looking at museums, you find that in the basement they have drawer after drawer after drawer of hundreds of thousands of fossils. And so certainly all these fossils, we should be able to fill in a lot of gaps. And so the God of the gaps, not a problem for us, but it's a big problem. The evolution of the gaps is a big problem for evolutionists.
Biggest gap to me is going from non-life to life, period. How do they
Yeah,
get from here to there?
another gap,
I mean, science, if anything, the observable science is by the law of biogenesis, right? I mean, life always comes from life. So where did
right?
that first gap get filled? How did something like a rock or inorganic substance something can become an organic molecule able to self-replicate? How did that happen?
That's
To
very
me,
true.
that's the biggest stumbling block ever before you ever get to any of this other stuff where they basically try to bridge it with, well, you've documented some of the false stuff, the fraudulent stuff they've done, but even stuff that's inadvertent, they'll just put stuff in there. Doug and I did a show years ago, Jerry. We where Doug had his great example. We could prove that the spoon evolved into a fork, and he puts a spork in the middle. We have a spoon and then a spork and then a fork, and see that proved evolution. No, they're each complete substance. They're incomplete and they're perfect in their own ways. And they were also they were engineered. They were not. They didn't. One didn't go turn into another one. But to me, this is what I it seems in the fossil record you're dealing with at best, what they do is they try to bridge things by fossil, but there's you don't have you have very little DNA evidence. You have no soft tissue to really work with much, let alone organic molecules to study from the fossil record for the most part. Although
I
that's
think
kind of, some of that's going away. That's really strange because they are finding some organic molecules in dinosaur skeletons of all things.
But anyway, that's a argument that I made back in my college days. That it was one that convinced me that evolution wasn't true. Was that I discovered that left-handed and right-handed amino acid problem,
Mm.
and also the problem of combining amino acids into peptides because you have to remove a water molecule. And they taught us in the chemistry class how that was done artificially by putting all of the amino acids in a resin rather than in water. And that's obviously an unnatural scenario where they were able to then chemically block off one end of the amino acid so that the other amino acid could attach to it correctly, and and then the yield was low, and then you'd have to go to attach the next one, block off the wrong end of the amino acid that you're attaching, and attach the ends that will properly match, and so you assemble that protein in that manner. And that was uh, I had a article I published in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, which is the same publication that Jerry was just referring to. That told the article's name was Interdependence in Macromolecule Synthesis: Evidence for Design. And so, if I were to publish that article today, I would call it "Zapping Amino Acids Creates a Whole Lot of Brown Sticky Goo."
yeah,
And
good point.
so, my point is that this is a gap that's permanent. It's a scientific fact that this chemistry doesn't allow amino acids to combine in a natural aqueous environment. You have to have something in a solid phase synthesis environment, which is artificially put together in order to replicate the actions that the body naturally does in our created world.
Well, it's a fallacy because by and large, it's not needed and it's rarely used by us because we don't have to explain how A becomes B. We believe A was created by God and B was created by God. End of story. Evolutionists, though, have to start out with nothing, basically. In the beginning was nothing, no time, space, matter, or energy. The Big Bang created time, space, matter, and energy. And so you have to go from nothing to everything. And they have thousands and thousands of gaps they have to fill where we don't. And so, therefore, they're speaking with forked tongue when they talk about this is a problem for us. And it's not in vast majority of cases. In fact, it's hard to come up with a case where we really say, well, there's a gap here. But by and large, the evolutionists have plenty of gaps, and therefore we need to use that argument against the group that deserves it, and that is the evolutionists.
Do you think that a little bit they're conflating? There's an old idea that I mean, you've probably heard this. If like ancient man saw an airplane flying, they think it's magic, or a television screen, they think it's magic, and they think that we're just appealing to magic for the creation. In other words, it's a conflating of something you can obviously see that is material. Okay, like a television screen or a flying airplane or a car. But they're saying, well, once we explained things, we're able to do things that they weren't able to do in the past. So that would have been apparent like magic. So the creation is is going to be the same thing. Once we just make more discoveries, we'll figure out how to unravel all this mystery. And all we end up doing is it seems to me we're creating more gaps every time. Every new discovery that comes up, it seems like they create more gaps than they had in the beginning. I mean, let's face it, the cell, when it started out, the cell was a blob of jelly. Now it's so complicated with everything, the ribosomes and the machinery of the cell, and nuclear. I mean, everything in there is so much more fire. All they created. Well, how did this start? This happened. Wow. And one thing after another, it's got giving them more gaps. But they have this
Yeah,
delusion because we are technologically advanced in some respects that which I'm not so sure. Maybe ancient man didn't know some things that we've forgotten. But that aside, let's just say knowledge has accumulated in the last, especially the last 300-400 years. But they put that idea, the idea that we're getting things better, people are not starving in some respects, or there's food available, at least in America. But that they've discovered new ways to do agriculture and new things. I don't know. I think that they're just conflating that idea with the mythological idea that they're going to discover some missing link, some mechanism, some ability to bridge that gap, but they just haven't discovered it yet. And that's what it seems to me. A lot of the arguments, it seems like they're putting putting it's almost like the argument that they're using. They're conflating empirical science with historical science. Forensic science. They're conflating the two things and trying to make them be the same, just like they do with the term with variation among species, among kinds. That's evolution, and they're trying to jump that gap, and that's going to explain macroevolution. And none
yeah,
of those things are true. Every one of their explanations seem to fall far short of it. But in the minds, deception is a powerful tool. When you want to believe something, you want to believe it, and that's the way it goes. But that's what I've been noticing. It just seems like, okay, well, we considered this magic back in the day, and now we can tell it's not. And so I'm just wondering if some of that isn't part of the way they're trying to conflate. Just seeing there's a combination of things that are like two different things, and they're trying to make them one thing.
yeah. Good point.
Now
And
there's a quote that you give in your article here, and I'm going to read it. It's what the leading atheist Michael Shermer explained, that belief in God in the gaps involves an intelligent designer agent, otherwise God, who miraculously intervenes just in places where science has yet to offer a comprehensive explanation for a particular phenomenon. And so, an ID used to control the weather, but now we understand it. We moved on to more difficult problems, as if we understand the weather now.
But you see what I'm saying, Doug? That's kind of what they've done.
And
by the
there was
by the way, Michael Shermer is no longer an atheist. He now says he is an agnostic. So he's making progress. Oh, he's an agnostic.
uh,
And he was
uh,
was a born again Christian. He claims at least. and he was on a seminary, and he became an atheist at seminary, ironically. And but now he's having second thoughts, and he realized that, well, maybe there is a God. So and then he's made a point. I'm no longer an atheist. I'm now an agnostic.
Mm.
Wow, I didn't know that.
I
Yeah,
think what the problem is miracles. And I think that there are so many miracles that we get used to them and don't recognize them as such, Like, for example, let's say this finger I'm pointing up. Why is it that it grows out to a certain length and just stops? Why doesn't it just keep on growing? But what is it that stops it? It's the computer code that God designed when He made all the things in this world. He made it so that when He designed things, it was beautiful. Now, also the founder of BioLogos, Francis Collins, as attempting to claim to have detected a miracle or instance of design in the natural world renders one liable to the charge of the committing the gobs of the gaps fallacy. That's not what we do. This is not technique that we use to explain God. We don't. We celebrate whenever science discovers something, I find that when we make a scientific discovery, all of a sudden we raise six more questions.
That's what I said
yeah,
earlier. Yeah.
And who was it that said that the every time that we discover a missing link, he says, I hate the term missing link. Every time we discover a new species, we create two more.
yeah. Well,
So
assuming you have one in the middle, and often we don't. They don't.
yeah, that's right. Uh, and so what the issue is that we have a narrative of evolution, which is a made-up story. It's not something that we really observe happening, or we can go back in the past and document what happened only by what we find in the present. We can find fossils in the present. We can find strata in the present. We can find uh, all these different creatures that God has created. But it makes much more sense to treat them as individually created kinds rather than something that went from a worm to man, through the zoo.
Yeah, that's very true.
But again, conflation happens when I mentioned earlier, they'll take, well, look at all the different dogs. I said, yeah. Well, we believe in a Noah's Ark, and from two dogs or dog kind, all the species have come out. But a dog is still a dog. It's not a cat or a reptile or a bird. Okay? And that's they conflate speciation with evolution. And I think that's a big problem. Of course, we did it to ourselves 100 years ago or 150 years ago when we tried to talk about fixity of species. We made a mistake doing that, using a man-made word term for a word and to describe a biblical truth, and that doesn't always work very well. In fact, it oftentimes works against us. I think we have. That's why but it's good for us, Jerry. I think we have to become very parsimonious in our conversation because we have to be very circumspect, I guess is a better word, to try to make sure we don't speak out of turn because it's real easy to use secular terms to describe a biblical reality, and then when that doesn't work, we look like idiots, kind of like. So that's
Yeah,
always that's a cautionary tale for us to be wise as the serpent, but without guile ourselves, like the dove. That's the thing we want to do. So,
Now, when has a creationist actually used the God of the gaps argument?
oh,
I
that's a
don't
good
think
question.
that's something that we've invented. I think this is a evolutionist invention that tries to describe what we are. It's a red herring or a straw man argument that evolutionists use to try to It's sort of like the spaghetti monster argument, where they think that the what we believe in is the celestial spaghetti monster.
Well,
Who
but don't you think sometimes, Jerry, you can correct me, but I feel sometimes it's people who really have not studied this like you have, and Doug like you, and creationists generally have had to study it and be on top of the game. But it's ignorant Christians who kind of put their foot in their mouth and speak about things they don't really know much about, and they'll say things, then they'll fall back on, well, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and that doesn't really, that's not very helpful. It's not really very helpful to an unbeliever, I don't think. But
No,
just
it's a good
I feel like there's Christians that have not done the kingdom of God they have not done it favors because they have not done their homework. And the church is kind of negligent in a lot of this stuff in some respects, I think.
good point. The Pew survey, when they do a good job, found why people reject, stop believing in their religion's teaching and become atheists. 46% said they were exposed to evolution and ideas that are contrary to the Christian scriptures in college, for example, most notably evolution. Now, part of it is scandals involving clergy. 32% said they left for that reason. And my religion's out of date, 23%. And so there are other reasons. But on the other hand, the major reason, about 84%, are because were not exposed to apologetics, which is the goal of apologetics is basically to answer by
Right.
evidence. The questions is what is what does the Bible teach and what's evidence for that? And so apologetics is the discussion of the evidence for what the Bible teaches. And so this is a very important part. In fact, I'm of course interested in apologetics pretty much my whole life, but I'm baffled in that how many churches will accept a presentation in apologetics? Basically zero. They're not interested. And I have to wonder, what in the world are churches teaching? They're not teaching apologetics because that's a major reason why people leave. And we know there's a huge exodus from the churches uh, and to the nuns, especially. That means no religion. And that exodus is largely a result of they just don't accept, they don't see the evidence for what their church, their religion teaches. And that's why apologetics, I think, should be stressed more. But yet, how many churches stress that? A few, but very few do. And so, in
Yeah.
many ways, the decline of Christianity in this country is the church's own fault. And you think they would realize this? People like me should be busy. Every weekend, I should be busy visiting a church and doing apologetics presentations. But now it's coming up. I'll be quite busy the next month. So I'll be doing, I don't know, probably 15 churches. But on the other
Wow.
hand, many months of the year, I do zero churches. So far in November, I have one church. October, zero churches. And so therefore, why don't they bring in speakers like me or other people? And they don't. So maybe this station, you could contact Doug or someone else and say, hey, well, why don't you bring somebody in who could present on this topic? My understanding is that very few ministers have any training in apologetics. Some might, but the vast majority don't. In fact, many don't really know what apologetics means. And I looked at seminaries and what they teach, and it's a rare seminary that has a good, strong course in apologetics. And to me, that should be the main thing or a major thing that churches teach. So,
I agree with you, but the church has always had problems, and unless the Holy Spirit blows in it and wakes them up, it's just the nature of the human being is I don't know, they is to settle into contentment. I feel like people they inoculate themselves with just enough religion to insulate themselves and immunize themselves against the power of God, and that's what I think apologetics opens that up. You're
Well,
right.
I think that we can maybe identify unbridgeable gaps that we know about, like the fossil record really does not show a sequence in the order that evolutionists expect, because we find there are geological areas where the order of fossils are actually reversed. And I
Oh
make
yeah.
a lot of references to that in my book. Don't let your geology mess up your theology. But that, I think, is a powerful argument. The gap from non-life and life is huge. prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom is a big gap, except that you can see that there is a creator who created chlorophyll and hemoglobin, and they're very similar in structure, and the ways that both kingdoms process those molecules are very similar up to a point where they one gets a magnesium, the other gets an iron. So those are instances where the gap is so wide that you can't traverse it. And that is the problems for evolution. It's not our problem, it's theirs.
Yeah, good point.
Amen.
We'll see
Good
you
point.
next time on Revolution Against Evolution. Have you noticed that at the beginning of the school year, National Geographic usually comes out with a new ape man fossil? Why is this? The pernicious message to our students is that you are not a descendant of Adam and Eve. The Bible story isn't true. Instead, Neanderthal, Java Man, and Lucy are your ancestors. You are simply the end result of millions of years of evolution, starting with slime. Dr. John Sanford has written this book, Contested Bones, challenging these claims. He examines each of the examples of fossil man and concludes that they are fully ape, completely human, or mixtures of bones from both. Here are his conclusions. Let's take these fossil discoveries. Neanderthal, Erectus, Naledi, the Hobbit are all fully human, is in decline. The discoverers claim is that they're subhuman species. Sebeda, habilis, and Lucy's kind are a mixture of human and Australopithecines. And then Ardipithecus is an extinct ape, likely mixed. Evolutionists will go so far to support their claims to the point where if the evidence doesn't fit what they expect, they will doctor it. They don't even hide this. Here is a clip from a PBS special on Lucy.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Now, would you want to base your whole life on these particular claims? I would say you would want to reject this whole concept of ape man.